A Minnesota nurse was shot dead in her apartment. Clues on the scene suggested she took her own life, but investigators suspected it was foul play. 48 Hours contributor and co-host of The Talk, Natalie Morales, is here with a preview of this week's 48 Hours.
In the early morning hours of December 16, 2022, a woman was standing alone inside a locked bathroom in a downtown St. Paul apartment. The light was on, the door was closed, and on the other side of that door was the man she loved. Moments later, a single gunshot ripped through the quiet. When police arrived, 32-year-old Alexandra Pennig was lying on the bathroom floor with a fatal wound to her head. Her boyfriend, Matthew Ecker, was the only other person inside the apartment. He told first responders that everything had been normal just moments earlier. That there had been no fight, no raised voices, no warning. According to him, she had suddenly grabbed his gun, locked herself inside the bathroom, and pulled the trigger before he could stop her. He said he forced the door open after the shot, rushed in, tried to help, and then washed his hands in the sink before calling 911. That was the story he stuck to. Inside the bathroom, nothing could argue back. A body on the floor, a gun nearby. A locked door that had been broken open. At first glance, it looked like the end of a tragic night. But something didn't sit right. Paramedics and officers moved through the apartment, stepping around shattered pieces of the door frame and the wreckage left behind when the bathroom was forced open. There were pills on the counter, bottles nearby. Enough details to make his story sound possible, yet there was a detail so small that most people would have missed it. A single piece of metal. Round, flat, no larger than a coin. It was lying on the bathroom floor, hidden under where her body had been, and it didn't belong there. That metal ring had come from the bathroom lock itself. The very lock, he said, had only broken when he kicked the door in after the gun went off. But if that were true, why was that piece underneath her? That question changed everything, because if the lock broke after the shot, the metal should have been on top of her, not buried beneath her weight. A locked door, a dead woman, a man who says she did it to herself, and a tiny piece of metal that says he's lying. What really happened in that bathroom begins with who broke that door first. Before we go any further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles if you want more cases told with depth, truth, and respect for the victims. And as you listen, remember, stories like this don't happen far away. They happen in places just like where you're watching right now. Before her name became attached to a police report, before it appeared in headlines or courtroom documents, Alexandra Pennig was simply Alex to the people who loved her. She was 32 years old, a nurse, a woman who had spent years working in clinics, caring for people at their most vulnerable. Her days were built around helping others through pain, sickness, and recovery. But Alex herself had not always had an easy road. Those who knew her best understood that she carried a complicated past. Alex had struggled for years with depression and addiction. It was not a secret. Her family didn't try to hide it, and neither did she. At one point, several years before her death, things had reached a breaking point. Her father, Jim Pennig, later told detectives that Alex had taken a handful of pills and then went to her mother and said she was trying to kill herself. That moment terrified her parents. They didn't ignore it. They didn't downplay it. They acted. They sent their daughter to rehab. Alex went through treatment, worked through the addiction that had controlled so much of her life, and eventually got clean. The process wasn't quick or easy, but she came out of it determined to rebuild. She trained, studied, and became a nurse, a job that required stability, discipline, and trust, and she held on to it. By the time detectives spoke to Alex's parents in December of 2022, her life looked nothing like the one she had lived years earlier. She wasn't spiraling. She wasn't isolated. She was working, making plans, and staying connected to her family. Just weeks before her death, she had been home for Thanksgiving. Her parents saw her, spoke with her, hugged her. There was no sense that she was preparing to leave the world behind. No quiet goodbye. No warning signs that this was someone about to end her own life. Then came the night of December 16. Alex had spoken to her mother, Mary Jo Pennig, that same evening. It wasn't a long call. It didn't need to be. But to Mary Jo, it sounded like her daughter. Not panicked, not withdrawn. Just Alex, talking about her day, talking about life. She was doing well, Mary Jo later told investigators. So when police showed up at her door with news that her daughter had been found dead from a gunshot wound inside her own bathroom, the idea that Alex had taken her own life didn't match what her parents knew about her. Jim Pennig told detectives that yes, Alex had tried to overdose years earlier. He didn't deny it. But he also made something else clear. That attempt had led to treatment, not a downward slide. Alex had gotten help. She had stayed sober. She had built a career. She had stayed in touch. This wasn't someone in the middle of a collapse. To Mary Jo, the thought that her daughter would suddenly pick up a gun and end her life without saying a word to anyone felt wrong. Mothers know their children in ways no one else does. And this story didn't sound like Alex. Yet the only person who could explain what happened that night was the man who had been with her when the gun went off. And his story was already being questioned. This is True Crime Chronicles. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to get more crime news. When Alexandra Pennig was found dead on the bathroom floor, there was no mystery about who had been with her in those final moments. Matthew Ecker was there. He was not a stranger. He wasn't a neighbor who heard something through the wall. He wasn't a passerby who discovered her too late. He was her boyfriend, a man who, like Alex, worked in the medical field as a nurse. They had met 2 years earlier while working at the same clinic. Over time, their professional connection turned personal, and they began a relationship that would tie their lives together in a way no one could have imagined. So when first responders arrived at the apartment that morning, Matthew Ecker was the one who met them. He was the one who explained what had happened. He was the one who shaped the very first version of Alex's final moments. According to Ecker, the night had started out normally. He told police that he and Alex had gone out together to several local bars. There was no argument, no tension, no bad energy between them. He said they were getting along just fine. When they left and headed back to Alex's downtown apartment, he claimed they were laughing in the car on the way home. Nothing, he said, had seemed off. Once inside the apartment, Ecker insisted that nothing changed. No fight, no shouting, no emotional blow-up. To him, the night was still going smoothly, until it suddenly wasn't. Ecker told first responders and later detectives that without warning, Alex grabbed his gun. He said she ran into the bathroom and locked the door behind her. Before he could get inside, before he could talk her down, before he could do anything, he said the gun went off. A single shot. Ecker said he immediately broke the bathroom door open. He told them he rushed inside and tried to help her. He said he did what he could in those moments, but it was already too late. Alex was gone. Then he said, he went to the sink. I tried to do what I could, Ecker told first responders. And then I washed my hands. That's why I don't have anything on my hands. After that, he called 911. To him, the story was simple. Alex had taken her own life, and he had arrived too late to stop it. When detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell sat down with him, they gave him multiple chances to change or clarify his account. They asked him directly if he and Alex had argued after getting back to the apartment. No, Ecker said. They asked him if there had been any kind of fight between them. Not between us, he replied. Over and over again, he returned to the same claim, that Alex had locked herself in the bathroom and that the gun had gone off behind a closed door. That gun went off behind a closed door, he told detectives. I did not shoot her. He stuck to that version for hours. To investigators, that consistency mattered. But so did something else. He was the only person who had been there. There's only one person who can tell us what happened. Detective O'Donnell said. He was the only one that was there. And the more they listened to him, the more they began to feel that something in his story wasn't lining up with what they were seeing at the scene. Because sometimes it's not what a person says that raises questions. It's what the evidence refuses to confirm. When homicide detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell arrived at the downtown St. Paul apartment in the early morning hours of December 16, 2022, they were responding to what had first been reported as a suicide. That classification alone shaped how the scene was initially viewed. A woman was dead in her own bathroom. A man inside the apartment said she had taken her own life. On paper, it sounded tragically straightforward. But crime scenes have a way of telling their own story. Inside Alex Pennig's apartment, the bathroom had become the center of everything. That was where her body had been found, lying on the floor with a single gunshot wound to her head. Nearby was the gun Matthew Ecker had admitted belonged to him. Around the room, there were signs that could support his version. There was alcohol in the apartment. There were 6 bottles of prescription medication, including antidepressants, all prescribed to Alex. For detectives, that detail stood out. Combined with what they would soon learn about her past, it gave weight to the idea that Alex may have been struggling. At first, nothing in the room screamed murder. But what matters in a death investigation isn't just what is present. It's how those details line up with the story being told. Ecker had said he heard the gunshot, broke open the bathroom door, rushed inside, and then washed his hands in the sink before calling 911. That claim, in particular, was important. Washing his hands would explain why there was no blood or gunshot residue on him. It would explain why he didn't look like someone who had just tried to save a woman who had been shot. But when first responders had gone into the bathroom, they noticed something strange. The sink was dry. Detective DeSanto would later explain why that mattered. If someone had just rushed into that bathroom and washed blood off their hands, there should have been water in the sink. The porcelain should have been wet. The faucet area should have shown signs of recent use. But it didn't. The sink was dry, DeSanto said. If he had said he called the police right away, that sink probably would have been still wet. But it was very dry in there. It was a small detail. The kind that could easily be overlooked, but it directly contradicted Ecker's story. And it wasn't the only thing that didn't sit right. The bathroom door had clearly been forced open. Pieces of the lock and frame were damaged. Ecker said he had done that after he heard the shot. But investigators couldn't yet prove whether the door had been broken before or after Alex was shot. They also took note of where Alex was found in relation to that door. Her body was on the bathroom floor, close to where the door had been. The positioning would soon become critical, though at that moment they didn't yet know why. As the forensic unit continued processing the scene, DeSanto and O'Donnell kept Ecker talking. They needed him to fill in the gaps. They needed his story to match what the apartment was showing them. But the longer the scene was examined, the more it felt like something was missing. The pills, the alcohol, the past history, all of that could point toward self-harm. But the dry sink, the forced door, the way Ecker described the timing, those details didn't line up as cleanly. And then, while the detectives were still questioning him, they got a call from the forensic team still working inside the bathroom. What they had found under Alex Pennig's body was about to change the case forever. While detectives worked through the apartment, another part of the investigation was unfolding quietly and painfully just a few miles away. Alexandra Pennig's parents were being told that their daughter was gone. For Mary Jo and Jim Pennig, the words didn't make sense, not because they didn't understand what they meant, but because they didn't match the Alex they had just seen and heard. Only weeks earlier, Alex had been home for Thanksgiving. She sat with her family. She talked about her life. She was present. There was no distance in her voice, no sign that she was shutting people out. She was still their daughter, the same one they had worried over years ago, but also the one who had worked hard to get better. On the night she died, Alex had spoken to her mother. Mary Jo remembered that call clearly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just a normal conversation between a mother and a daughter who stayed in touch. To Mary Jo, nothing in Alex's voice suggested that this was someone preparing to disappear forever. She was doing well, Mary Jo later said. So when detectives told them that Alex had been found dead from a gunshot wound in her bathroom, and that the man who had been with her said she had taken her own life, the explanation didn't sit right. Jim Pennig didn't hide Alex's past from the detectives. He told them about the overdose attempt years earlier. He described how Alex had taken pills and then gone to her mother to say she was trying to kill herself. That moment had shaken their family to the core. It was the reason they had pushed her into rehab. It was the reason they had fought so hard to help her survive. But that crisis had led to something else. Recovery. Alex had gotten clean. She had stayed sober. She had built a career. She had stayed connected to her family. The girl who had once been so lost had worked her way back to a life that looked stable. That mattered to her parents. Because people who are planning to take their own lives often begin to pull away. They stop calling. They stop showing up. They start closing doors. Alex hadn't done any of that. Thanksgiving wasn't long ago. The phone call with her mom had been just hours before she died. To Mary Jo and Jim, there had been no goodbye in any of it. That didn't mean Alex hadn't struggled. It meant that, at least in their eyes, the version of their daughter described by Matthew Ecker didn't match the person they knew. To them, something else felt wrong. The fact that the story about her death was coming entirely from one person. Ecker had been the only one inside the apartment. The only one in the bathroom. The only one who could describe what happened between the moment they got home and the moment the gun went off. Alex's parents couldn't speak for her anymore. But they knew her. And the version of events they were being told didn't sound like their daughter at all. By the time detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell sat Matthew Ecker down for questioning, they had already seen enough inside the apartment to know this case wasn't as simple as it first appeared. Ecker was calm. He was cooperative. And he repeated the same account again and again. He told them that he and Alex had gone out together that night, moving from bar to bar, spending time the way couples do. According to him, nothing had gone wrong. There was no argument on the drive home, no anger, no tension. He said they were laughing as they headed back to her place. Once they were inside the apartment, he claimed everything stayed normal. Detective DeSanto asked him directly if there had been any kind of conflict between him and Alex when they got back. "You guys weren't arguing or anything?" she asked. "No," Ecker replied. "There's no fight with you two?" she pressed. "Not between us," he said. That exchange mattered. Investigators weren't just trying to confirm a timeline. They were trying to understand what the emotional atmosphere had been like before the gun went off. Bites don't always leave marks on walls, but they leave patterns in behavior. And Ecker was firm. There had been none. He returned to the same description of Alex's final moments. He said she suddenly grabbed his gun. He said she ran into the bathroom. He said she locked the door. And he said that a moment later, he heard the shot. That gun went off behind a closed door. Ecker told them, "I did not shoot her." He described forcing the door open after the gun went off. He described trying to help her. He described washing his hands. He described calling 911. Every time detectives circled back to those moments, he didn't change anything. To DeSanto and O'Donnell, that consistency was both useful and troubling. On one hand, people who are lying often trip over their own stories. On the other, rehearsed lies don't always fall apart quickly. So they compared what he said to what the apartment had shown them. Ecker said he washed his hands. The sink was dry. Ecker said the door broke after the shot. The forensic team was still examining that door. Ecker said there was no argument. Alex's parents said their daughter had sounded fine hours earlier, but that didn't explain what might have happened inside that apartment. As the interview went on, detectives waited for the moment when something would crack. Then, the phone rang. It was the forensic unit. They had found something in the bathroom that had been hidden beneath Alex Pennig's body. Something that would decide whether Matthew Ecker's story could still stand. And in that instant, the case shifted from a question of belief to a matter of physics and timing. When the call came in from the forensic unit, Detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell were still sitting across from Matthew Ecker, listening to him repeat the same account of how Alex Pennig had died. What the technicians had just found inside the bathroom changed everything. After Alex's body was moved, something was revealed on the floor beneath where she had been lying. It was a small, round piece of metal, shaped like a ring, about the size of a quarter. It wasn't part of her clothing. It wasn't debris from the floor. It wasn't random trash. It was part of the bathroom door lock. Jennifer O'Donnell would later describe the moment they learned what it was. Once Alex was moved, she said, they found underneath where Alex had been laying was a round metal piece. The forensic team had matched it to the damaged lock on the bathroom door. That detail mattered for one reason: timing. Matthew Ecker's story depended on the idea that Alex had locked herself inside the bathroom, shot herself, and only then did he break the door open to get to her. In that version of events, the lock would have snapped after she was already on the floor. But the metal ring wasn't on top of her body. It was underneath it. That meant the lock had broken before Alex fell. There was no way around that. If Ecker had kicked the door in after the gun went off, the broken piece of the lock would have landed on top of Alex, not under her. The only way it could be beneath her weight was if the door had already been forced open before she was shot. For us, O'Donnell said, it meant that the door was forced open before she was shot. That single piece of metal took Ecker's story apart. Because now, the locked bathroom no longer worked as an explanation. If the door had been broken before the gun went off, then Alex was no longer alone in that room when she was shot. And that meant Matthew Ecker's version of the night could not be true. Detectives began to see a different sequence of events emerging from the evidence. One that didn't involve a quiet, sudden act behind a closed door. They believed Alex and Ecker had argued after returning to the apartment, that she had locked herself in the bathroom to get away from him, that Ecker had forced the door open while she was still alive, that the metal ring had snapped off and dropped to the floor, and that after the door was broken, Alex was shot. Then she collapsed, right on top of the evidence. In that moment, the case stopped being about whether Alex had taken her own life. It became about who had been standing in that bathroom when the gun went off. And all signs pointed back to the same man who had said he never pulled the trigger. If you haven't already, subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles for more real stories told with truth and respect. Once the metal ring from the bathroom lock was recovered, the case against Matthew Ecker was no longer built on theory. It was built on physical evidence. The detectives didn't need a confession to know something had gone wrong. They had something stronger, a piece of the door that told them exactly when the bathroom had been breached. Jennifer O'Donnell explained why it mattered so much. If Alex Pennig had truly been alone behind a locked door when the gun went off, the lock would have broken afterward, when Ecker forced his way in. In that scenario, the metal ring would have fallen on top of her body. But it didn't. It was beneath her. That could only happen if the door had already been broken before Alex was shot. That meant she was not alone when the trigger was pulled. From there, detectives began reconstructing what must have happened inside that small bathroom, using only what they could prove. Matthew Ecker had admitted that the gun was his. He had admitted that he was inside the apartment. He had admitted that he was the last person to see Alex alive. He also claimed that he had washed his hands after trying to help her, but the sink was dry. That contradiction suggested that he had not done what he said he did after the gun went off. The broken door told another part of the story. Alex had been behind it, the lock had been damaged, the ring had snapped off, and that damage had occurred before the shot. Taken together, the scene pointed to a confrontation that didn't end with Alex alone in the bathroom. Detectives believed that after returning from the bars, Alex and Ecker had argued. At some point, Alex had gone into the bathroom and locked the door, likely to get away from him. Ecker then forced the door open, breaking the lock and causing the metal ring to fall to the floor. Only after that did the gun go off. Alex's body then fell to the ground, landing directly on top of the broken piece of the lock, sealing it under her weight until the forensic team found it. None of that required speculation. It was the only sequence that fit the physical evidence. Ecker's account that the gun went off behind a locked door and that he broke it open afterward could no longer stand. The door itself proved it wrong. That was enough for prosecutors. Matthew Ecker was charged with second-degree murder. At trial, the broken lock ring became the centerpiece of the case. It showed jurors that this was not a suicide behind a closed door. It was a shooting that happened after the barrier between Alex and the man she was with had already been destroyed. In February 2024, the jury reached its decision. Matthew Ecker was found guilty. He was later sentenced to 30 years in prison. Alex Pennig, never got to tell anyone what happened inside that bathroom. But the evidence she fell on did it for her, and it told a story that no lie could cover up. By the time Matthew Ecker was convicted, the case no longer hinged on his words. It rested on what a silent room had revealed. A bathroom no larger than most walk-in closets had become the place where the truth refused to stay hidden. Not because anyone spoke, not because a camera captured it, but because a single object ended up in the only place it could not have been if Ecker's story were true. Alex Pennig's body had covered that broken lock ring. That detail turned out to be stronger than any argument, stronger than any denial. It proved that the door separating Alex from the man she was with had already been breached before she was shot, and that fact stripped away the only thing protecting Ecker's version of events. There was no locked door anymore. There was no sealed room. There was no moment where Alex was alone. Once that was understood, the rest of the case made sense. Alex had not been found in a position that suggested someone had calmly ended her own life in isolation. She had been found in the very space where the barrier meant to protect her had been destroyed. Whatever had happened between her and Ecker did not end with her safely behind a door. It ended with her on the floor. The legal system does not convict based on feelings or instincts. It convicts on what can be shown. And what could be shown here was simple. Ecker's story required the lock to have broken after the gunshot. The lock had broken before. That was all the jury needed. In February 2024, Matthew Ecker was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was later sentenced to 30 years in prison. For Alex's parents, the verdict did not bring their daughter back, but it did confirm what they had believed from the beginning, that what they were told about her death was not the truth. Mary Jo and Jim Pennig had known their daughter. They had spoken to her hours before she died. They had seen her weeks earlier at Thanksgiving. They had watched her fight through addiction and rebuild her life. The version of Alex who would suddenly and silently end everything inside a bathroom did not exist to them. And the evidence proved they were right. This case did not turn on a confession. It did not turn on a witness. It turned on a mistake. A piece of a lock that fell to the floor at the wrong time. Because when someone tries to rewrite what happened, the smallest details often refuse to cooperate. Alex Pennig's story was never told in words. It was told in where she fell. Alexandra Pennig's life ended on the floor of a bathroom, behind a door that was supposed to protect her. The last thing standing between her and the man she was with was a simple lock. Not a weapon, not a wall, just a thin piece of metal designed to keep someone out. And when that lock broke, the truth fell with it. There was no camera in that room, no one else inside to speak for her. No recording of what was said before the gun went off. What remained was what couldn't be erased. A broken door, a dry sink, a single gunshot, and a small metal ring that ended up beneath her body. Matthew Ecker told police that Alex locked herself inside and pulled the trigger. He said he broke the door down after it was too late. He said he washed his hands and called for help. But the room didn't agree with him. The sink was dry. The lock was broken too soon, and Alex had fallen on top of the one thing that proved she was not alone when she died. In February 2024, a jury listened to the evidence. They didn't need emotion. They didn't need speculation. They needed one clear answer to one simple question. Was Alex behind a locked door when she was shot? The evidence said no. Matthew Ecker was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Alex Pennig was 32 years old, a nurse, a daughter, a woman who had fought through addiction and built a life that still had time left in it. Her story did not end the way she was first described. It ended because the person with her that night crossed a line that could not be undone. And that broken lock, the one that failed her, became the thing that finally told the truth. If this case stayed with you, share it. Stories like Alex's disappear when people stop paying attention. And tell us in the comments, what part of this case hit you the hardest?